Okay, greetings one and all. Okay, hope you can see me okay. So this lecture is the first in what will probably be a series of 3 lectures on humanitarian intervention, following on from our work on human rights. And in this lecture I want to tackle basically I'm going to give you a brief history of humanitarian intervention since the 1990s. But in so doing, I hope to also answer kind of 3 questions on the issue of humanitarian intervention. Why calls for humanitarian intervention and support for humanitarian intervention grew in the 1990s, why that support tended to fade somewhat in the 2000s, and why intervention occurs in some cases and not others. So those are the 3 issues that I'm hoping to tackle along the way. But I'm going to present this lecture chronologically as a kind of brief history of humanitarian intervention over the last 3 decades. So just as a recap, we know human rights are the rights to which all human beings are entitled simply by virtue of being human. These rights are seen as absolute, unconditional, and fundamental. And just as by means of a recap, so the key document defining what we mean by human rights is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, produced in 1948, which outlined in its 30 articles what it considered the key rights to which all human beings are entitled, and all governments should therefore respect and uphold those human rights wherever in the world they are. The question, of course, is how should these be upheld, particularly when there are governments who do not seem to be concerned with upholding them. And we've looked at a variety of ways this can take place, from kind of soft to more hard power. So the softest level, if you like, there's the soft persuasive power of groups like NGOs, like Amnesty International, international human rights NGOs, or groups like the UN Human Rights Council, putting some kind of reputational pressure or moral pressure on governments by highlighting abuses and atrocities that take place, and hoping that out of concern for their reputation, governments will mend their ways. Secondly, then, we've seen the establishment of various international courts and tribunals that deal with human rights. So we looked at the European Court of Human Rights and also the International Court of Justice. But of course, these 2 bodies have no coercive power. They have no means to actually enforce their rulings against recalcitrant governments. We've then looked at other types of courts and tribunals, so the ad hoc UN tribunals that were set up from the 1990s onwards to deal with specific conflicts, like the conflict in Rwanda or Yugoslavia. And then following on from that, the more sort of permanent version, a global version of that, the International Criminal Court, which of course a step forward, arguably, from the ECHR and the ICJ, and that they do have the power to prosecute individuals for atrocities such as war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide. But of course we know a limitation of the criminal court and of the tribunals is that they can only really operate and actually arrest individuals with the cooperation of the relevant authorities and governments. Which means that you have, for example, famous case, International Criminal Court have indicted Omar al-Bashir, president of Sudan, for war crimes committed in Darfur and South Sudan. And but they don't have the cooperation of the government of Sudan, and so they can't get hold of him or arrest him and so on. So there's a major limitation. So we've also looked at how conditionalities can be used to pressure governments to respect human rights. So governments can be told you'll only be allowed to join this international organisation such as the EU if you uphold human rights. There can be, we'll only trade with you, you'll only be allowed to as a trading partner if you uphold certain human rights conditions, and perhaps sanctions will follow if you don't, and so on. But ultimately there's a feeling amongst some people that none of these are really enough. If you really get a state, a government that is determined to continue with atrocities and human rights abuses, that doesn't care about its reputation, that won't cooperate with international courts and tribunals, that would not succumb to sanctions or be, lured by the promise of membership of certain groups. There are just some cases when none of these measures work and a more hard kind of power is necessary to uphold human rights in certain extreme situations. And this has led some to believe in the idea of humanitarian intervention, which very simply, and get this definition down, very simply means the use of military force solely for humanitarian reasons as opposed to strategic, say, or economic reasons. So it's really the use of military force to deal with human rights violations, if you like. And calls grew for humanitarian intervention, particularly in the 1990s. I would argue for two main reasons. And as with so much we study in this whole unit, both of these reasons had to do with the end of the Cold War. So the two reasons, if I just sum them up and then I'll go into more detail. Two main reasons really. One, there was seen as a greater need for humanitarian intervention emerging in the 90s. And secondly, there was a greater possibility for actually carrying out such interventions as well. And as I say, both linked and were a result of the end of the Cold War. So first of all, why was there seen as a greater need for humanitarian interventions? Well, the Cold War, in the eyes of many international relations scholars, had actually been a source of stability in the world, in the global order. Because most of the world really was divided into these two camps, the pro-Soviet camp or the pro-US camp. It's called a bipolar system, two kind of poles of power. And this, many scholars have argued, a bipolar system like this produces a relative stability because everyone knows where they stand, right? You're in this camp or you're in that camp. Now, and of course, as we've looked at, linking to the nuclear issue, what we mean by those camps is that most of the world's governments were allied to one or other of the two major superpowers and had the protection of those superpowers. They were under their nuclear umbrella, if you like. Now, the end of the Cold War then, conversely, led to instability as superpowers withdrew their support for a number of governments. They withdrew that nuclear umbrella, that kind of guarantee of protection. And that led to a number of governments that previously had felt pretty strong because they had the backing of the Soviets or the backing of the US, led them to actually feel quite weak and vulnerable. And their own populations and opposition movements saw them as weaker and vulnerable. And this led to a number of rebellions and insurgencies, violent rebellions, in a number of countries, leading in turn to civil wars and atrocities and so on. This was particularly the case in the case of Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, where the collapse of the Soviet Union was really gave hope, I suppose, to anti-communist forces and nationalist forces in Yugoslavia that also wanted to break up Yugoslavia and have their own separate nation states like Croatia, Slovenia and so on. These groups had been kind of suppressed under communism, and those opposition movements always knew that there was always the danger that actually the Soviet Union might intervene on behalf of the Yugoslav government if they pushed their rebellion too far. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia looked more vulnerable as an isolated communist state, and this gave impetus to nationalist groups seeking to break away from Yugoslavia to rise up. And that led to a vicious state response and civil war, basically. Similar kind of pattern occurred arguably in Rwanda, where civil war broke out. Again, arguably because the government had lost its great power backer and seemed more weak and vulnerable and so on. So this is the basic argument that the end of the Cold War produced arguably a greater need for humanitarian intervention because it produced instability in the world, and that led to civil wars, and in the context of civil wars these kind of abuses and atrocities occur, and so there was more conflict leading to greater calls for people to intervene to stop the abuses occurring during those conflicts. Second reason, there were growing calls for humanitarian intervention, also linked to the end of the Cold War, was that there seemed to be a greater possibility of actually carrying out such interventions and actually getting UN Security Council authorization for such interventions. Now, again, and be ready with your pause button here. I'll throw in a few questions I want you to think if you can answer before I answer them. So I've kind of given the game away for the first one, but what institution is it that needs to authorize military action in order for it to be legal under international law? Well, of course we know it's the UN Security Council. But what was it that stopped the UN Security Council from authorizing humanitarian interventions throughout most of the 20th century? Well, again, it was the Cold War. It was disagreement amongst superpowers. Remember, both the Soviet Union and the US, as well as Britain and France and China, had a permanent seat on the Security Council, as they still do. But during the Cold War, neither side would authorize an intervention against one of their allies. So the Soviet Union would always veto calls for an intervention against one of their allies, and the US would always veto calls for intervention against one of their allies. So the Security Council was kind of at an impasse during the Cold War. It was never going to authorize an intervention because, as I say, the whole world was divided into two camps. So it would always be at the expense of one or other of those camps. Do you see? Now, with the end of the Cold War then, Russia's been weakened. The whole system of alliances has collapsed, that's one thing, and also Russia's been weakened, so it's less willing to challenge the West in the UN, or certainly in the 1990s it was. Things are slightly different now. And it was similar for China as well. During the 90s, China really wanted to kind of get its head down and focus on its domestic economy and not really cause too many disputes and frictions and things in international affairs. So Russia's been less willing to use its veto to block Western actions, or certainly in the 90s it was, because it had its own problems and it didn't want to cause a stir and pick a fight with the West and so on. At the same time, Russia has become much less powerful than it was in the Soviet days, and so it would be less able to oppose Western actions even if it wanted to. So two good examples of each of these. So in Iraq in 1991, the US and Britain went to war against Iraq over Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. Now, that war against Iraq, which was a very bloody, brutal war, would never have been allowed by the Soviet Union during the Cold War. They'd have said, no, Iraq's our ally, you can't do that. And they certainly wouldn't authorize such an intervention in the UN. But they did they didn't use their veto against the war on Iraq in 1991 because they had their own problems. They weren't willing to challenge the West. They're actually becoming dependent on the West for financial support during that difficult period after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So they weren't in a position to rock the boat, if you like. Another example, Kosovo in 1999, there was a humanitarian intervention that involved bombing Yugoslavia by NATO over the Kosovo issue.